Hi, welcome back to Rebel Movement Podcast. My name is Billy. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her. And today we have the awaited part two episode with Ashley Sorensen. If you weren't here for episode 96, Ashley was a guest and she came on and we talked about the menstruation cycle, menstruation and cycles, and kind of what each part of the cycle looks like. This episode, we are doing a recap and then we're talking about kind of how to live a little bit more in sync with your cycle. So it's the stuff that we didn't get to talk about in the last episode. It is a long one, so you might grab a coffee or a tea, get comfy, or whatever you need to do. And I hope you love it. If you have any questions, you can use the little link below in Spotify if you swipe down, or you can just send me an email, info@movewithbilly.com. Thanks so much. Enjoy. Hi, welcome back. I'm so excited for part two.
Hi,
Um,
Billy. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. We were just chatting a little bit before we hit record, and I got so excited about it that I totally forgot how to start this. Um, can you, and I forgot to hit the little timer button. Can you tell people who you are and what you do and your pronouns?
Yes, yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Sorensen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a yoga teacher and cyclical living mentor. This is my second episode back because we just had so much to talk about in the first
Hmm.
episode. Um, so what I do, quote unquote, in terms of the things I'm passionate about and that I care about and that I help people with is really I combine yogic practices and menstrual cycle education to help menstruators, help cyclical beings understand their bodies better, to live in alignment with their cyclical nature instead of at odds with it, and use the types of practices that have been beneficial in my own life to create more balance and harmony in both their cycles and their lives overall.
Hmm.
So yeah, I teach yoga, I teach meditation, which of course is yoga, but worth mentioning separately just
For
for
sure.
clarity's sake. Um, and I educate a lot about cycle health and how to create healthier, happier cycles. And just really simply, like even just understanding our cycles, because there's such a lack of education um, about our bodies, probably in
Yeah,
many different ways, but especially when it comes to cycle health. And yeah, so that's what I do. And that's what I'm passionate about. And that's what I love. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today.
perfect. And you asked this lot, you said this last time. It's okay if you don't want to share it or if you don't know, but I just figured I would ask. Last time you shared the day of your cycle that you were on,
Yes.
which I thought was cute.
Yeah. Yes.
Um, do you know the day of the cycle that you're on?
Of course I do. I'm I am only obsessed. But yeah, I'd be happy to share. So I'm currently on cycle day 3,
Hmm.
which I'm pretty sure when we last recorded, I was on cycle day 3 or 4. So it's interesting
Oh,
that I'm
cool.
almost in the exact same place in my cycle.
Yeah,
So if
that's
you don't know
funny.
what that means, I know. So I was like, I noticed it as I was driving over here. I was like, wait a minute, it must have been about a month.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, if you don't know what that means, cycle day 3 is I'm still on my period, so I'm currently bleeding. And but I'm starting, you can probably hear from my voice, like I'm starting to feel that upswing of energy kind of coming back to life, definitely feeling more um social, more playful than I did 2 days ago on cycle day 1, where I had some
Hmm.
pretty gross cramps, to be completely honest. And I was like
Hmm.
curled up on the couch asking my husband to bring snacks to me. um, but yeah, so I'm on cycle day 3. Cycle day 1 is the first day of your period, just for clarity's sake, which I know we're going to get into a little
Hmm.
recap of the cycle basics in a minute. But yeah, I'm on cycle day 3, um, bleeding, but feeling good. How are you
Good.
feeling?
I'm okay. I don't know if I shared this last time, but my period is like 35, 40 days long.
Yeah.
I'm cycle day 13. I don't remember what that means, if
Mm.
I'm being totally honest.
That's
Um,
okay.
and I think I shared before, like I alluded to the fact that I have like very bad cramps. I'm like being tested for some things and
Yeah.
um my period's a little all over the place. I've been working with someone for a little while, a naturopath.
Yeah.
I have talked to my doctor as well, but they don't take me seriously very well.
Yeah.
I'll just
That
say,
sounds
but
unfortunately familiar. Yep.
yeah. And I was working with a naturopath, and just last, we've tried like quite a few different things to help support. And this last time they were like, I think something else is going on here. Like, have you like gotten tested for some things? And I was like, oh yeah, actually I'm on the wait list too.
Of
But
course.
yeah,
Yeah.
so last week felt great. This week feel exhausted and can't
Mm.
sleep. Well, I don't know if that's part of the cycle
Mm.
thing too, but
Oh, it's
anyway.
something I actually am planning to talk about
Oh,
today.
okay. I'm
So look
gonna
at that. That's
That's fun.
amazing.
Okay, cool. So just in case if you're listening, if you don't remember the episode, I just wrote it down before we recorded. It's episode 96. We'll do a little recap just if you were like, oh, I listened, but I don't remember. We're gonna do a little like recap, review, whatever in a second. But if you didn't catch the first episode, definitely go back and listen to episode 96. I learned a ton. And it was a great episode. So you don't need, if you need, like, you don't necessarily need to listen to that one before this one, but I would recommend it because you'll get a lot more in-depth
Yeah.
education about the cycle. So,
Yeah,
is there anything you want
exactly.
to say before we get into like the recap part of it?
Um, no, I say we just jump right in if you're ready.
Cool. Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, cool. And obviously feel free to like interrupt me with questions or like, wait, what does that mean? Or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is, because I know I
Okay.
can start rambling and getting, carried away by the current of my own talking.
Fair, same. I can do the
Um,
same.
but yeah, I will try to keep our recap fairly brief. Again, with the disclaimer of like, this is the basics, the foundation, so you understand everything else that we're going to talk about after. But
Mm-hmm.
if you want to go more in depth and learn more, again, as you said, go back to episode 96, chock full, an hour ish, I think, or maybe even longer,
Yeah.
conversation about the cycle a little more in depth.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that being said, I say we just go through, I'll just very briefly go through what is happening in the reproductive system through all parts of the cycle, because you may be very familiar with certain aspects and maybe not as much with other aspects. So I think that will just be helpful to kind of cover what's happening very briefly throughout all parts. So
Mm-hmm.
before I jump in, but one more tiny thing before I jump in, which you very smartly recommended me to do, would be a little disclaimer to say I'm using the rough guidelines of a 29-day cycle
Mm-hmm.
because it's the quote unquote most common for people within their menstruating, the kind of middle years of menstruating years. But know that there's a lot of variation that's healthy and normal within person to person, even within the same person, cycle to cycle. So just know that this is not like written in stone. This is exactly
Mm-hmm.
how your cycle should look. This is just kind of like one example, and there could be a lot of variation in different aspects, which I can mention, briefly as we go along.
Cool.
So with that being said, now I'll jump in. So cycle day one is the first day. It's considered the first day of your cycle, and that is the first day of your period. And this is the first day where you're really like bleeding in earnest, where you actually need to use a product like a pad, a tampon, menstrual cup, period underwear, whatever products it is that you prefer. You might spot for a day or two before your cycle. I personally do almost every cycle. So that's normal. That's expected, but it's considered the first day of your cycle when you're like, oh, now it's really my period. So cycle day one is the first day of your period. This is known as the menstrual phase. There are 4 phases throughout the entire roughly 29-day cycle. And this first phase is probably the one you're most familiar with. It's the most obvious because you're bleeding. So pretty well known, the period. You might be experiencing cramps, fatigue, of course, literal blood loss. And this phase is when your two kind of what I call the star hormones of your cycle, estrogen and progesterone, are the lowest compared to other times in the cycle. So during this phase, estrogen and progesterone are low, and what's happening physically inside is the muscles of the uterus are contracting, releasing to loosen and push out that uterine lining that built up over the past cycle. Yeah, that's pretty obvious, pretty self-explanatory. If you've ever had a period, You don't need me to explain it to you. You know what it feels like, what it looks like, what it experiences like. So that's it. That's the first phase. After your period is ending, now we're moving into the follicular phase. And it's called this because the follicles inside the ovaries are continuing and finishing up their development journey. So your brain releases follicle stimulating hormone, which prompts the follicles to continue to grow and develop. And as they grow and develop, they produce estrogen. So during this phase, after your period is ended, you're moving energetically up as estrogen is rising, probably feeling a little higher energy, maybe a little more social, more communicative. I don't know if that's exactly the word, but literally estrogen helps us helps improve our language processing and communication skills. So during this phase, you might be feeling a little more social, a little more upbeat, a little more like willing to go out and on an adventure, try new things, that type of vibe. What's happening inside the body, which you might not be aware of or might not know, is that estrogen is causing the uterine lining to build back up. So basically during your period, it was, wiped clean slate. And now during this phase, the lining is starting to grow and thicken again to prepare for a possible pregnancy. So follicular phase continues. And as estrogen is rising, that signals to the body like, okay, now the follicle is fully developed, that egg is ready, and it's time to ovulate. The brain releases luteinizing hormone, which causes the actual moment of ovulation. So the third phase we refer to as the ovulatory phase. Really, ovulation is just that one single moment where an egg bursts forth. But I would refer to the couple days before, couple days after of that specific event as the ovulatory phase, because all of these hormonal changes, kind of like this whole cocktail of hormones, how it affects your energy, how you feel, mood, libido, all of those things has an effect, not just in that one singular second for the couple days before and after. So as we move into the ovulatory phase, probably feeling energy high. You also have a spike of testosterone during this phase. So estrogen is at its peak. You have the luteinizing hormone coming into play to help that actual process of ovulation. You also have testosterone peaking. So you might be experiencing a higher libido, higher energy, maybe feeling confident, maybe feeling sexier. All of those things are potentially happening, kind of brewing with this combination of hormones around ovulation. What's happening inside, what ovulation literally is when the egg bursts forth from the follicle, bursts forth from the ovary, and gets swept up and begins to move through the fallopian tube. After ovulation, the egg lives for 12, maximum 24 hours. So as soon as that egg leaves the follicle, what's left over, the kind of shell of the follicle, reforms into a small structure called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is what begins producing our second star hormone, which is progesterone. So as soon as you ovulate, it's almost like a little timer goes off and the corpus luteum begins producing progesterone. And now we move into the fourth and final phase of the cycle, which is the luteal phase. This is typically the longest phase of the cycle, but it's also the most fixed, for lack of a better word, because we're humans, nothing is exactly clockwork. However, this part of the cycle is typically the most predictable lengthwise. It's pretty much the same time because the corpus luteum is basically like a little timer producing progesterone for a set amount of time, unless you conceive and become pregnant. Then that's a whole other story. But if you don't, well, let me back up. So as progesterone begins to rise during this phase, it peaks about midway through the luteal phase. And then if pregnancy didn't happen, of course, your body is smart. It realizes, oh, the egg must have died. It must have dissolved. Nothing implanted in the uterine lining. This period of I shouldn't say period because that could be misleading. This phase of the cycle, is commonly referred to as infertility circles, especially as the 2-week wait, because it's that moment from ovulation up until either you're able to confirm that the egg was fertilized and did implant in the uterine lining and you became pregnant, or it didn't. And in that case, you have a period again. So during this phase, your body is basically waiting to see if the egg, as it's going down the fallopian tube, was met by sperm successfully, they connected, and the egg then moved into the uterus and implanted successfully, burrowed into the lining and started to grow into a baby. But if it didn't, then the body, of course, is smart and realizes that progesterone begins to drop down, estrogen begins to drop down. And as they drop, that's the signal for your period to start again and for the cycle to start all over again. So what else is happening inside the body during the luteal phase is the progesterone is causing the lining to thicken even further. And I used this analogy last time, and I think it's very helpful. Estrogen, if they were builders, estrogen is like putting up the walls, putting up the structure, and progesterone is coming in and putting in the insulation, filling the walls, putting the sheetrock and mudding and drywall and all of that stuff. So it's like they work together in completing that task of creating thick, healthy uterine lining for an egg to implant and grow. And of course, if that doesn't happen, then you experience that in your next period. Yeah, I think that sort of covers it.
I think
for
so.
the basics. And then it starts all over again and again and again and again.
Yeah. Can you remind me how long typically the luteal phase is?
Yes. So I'll go phase by phase just to kind of cover all our basics. So your period is typically cycle day 1 to, let's say, cycle day 6, about 5 days. The follicular phase, again, this is, I want to say, very typical experience. If yours doesn't match up with this exactly, nothing is going wrong necessarily. But this is just like a very rough guideline to understand. So then the follicular phase, we would say cycle day 7 to, let's say, cycle day 13. The ovulatory phase, those few days surrounding ovulation, let's say cycle day 14 to cycle day 17. And then the luteal phase would be 17 to 29. So ideally you want to see the luteal phase. It's referred to as the 2-week wait because 14 days would be kind of like considered the like gold standard from the point of ovulation until your next bleed. But maybe yours is a couple days less than that or a couple days more. Typically, you would consider if it were 17 days or longer, either a couple things happened. Either you didn't really know correctly which day ovulation happened, or you're pregnant. So there's two possible things there, which I know we talked about a lot in the last episodes. If you ever think, oh my God, my period's always late, and you have that anxiety of wondering if you're pregnant, if you did have unprotected sex where sperm were in contact with your body, then you might be thinking, like, oh my God, am I pregnant? What happened? And I know I spent many years in anxiety because I was a not careful college student and, having promiscuous sex probably, if I'm being completely honest.
Nothing wrong with
But it's very helpful to understand how to identify ovulation. I know we talked about that in the last episode a lot. So if you're like, wait, how do I know how long my luteal phase is? How long do I know all of these things? Definitely revisit that episode for sure.
Yes, for sure. Because I think we also briefly talk about how to tell if you're ovulating, and then we give resources for even more in depth in the show notes and in speaking.
Yeah, exactly.
Sweet. Thanks for the recap. I think it's I still learned stuff from this, even though I was obviously there for the first interview, or the first guest. But so today we're wanting to talk about. You are wanting to talk about, I'm not an expert in this, but we're talking about like living within your cycle or aligning your life with your cycle, that kind of thing, which I'm really excited about. We kind of alluded to it a little bit last time. So I'll just let you lead the way. Where do you think is the best place to start with this?
Yeah, thank you. I think let's start with kind of briefly explaining, again, this is something we talked about a lot more in depth in the first episode, so definitely go back and revisit that, but kind of briefly touching on cycle tracking and the importance of tracking and how you can use that to your benefit, whether or not you ever want to get pregnant, like outside the realms of fertility, because I know you also have talked to fertility expert on the podcast too. So like go to them for the fertility questions. I'm not against fertility at all. Like I think it's amazing, but understanding our cycles goes so far beyond the whole concept of fertility. Even people who have zero interest in ever becoming pregnant, ever having a child, ever bearing children, ever doing anything related to that realm, you still can benefit so much from learning about your cycle. It goes so far beyond the concept of fertility or the conversation of fertility. So
Mm-hmm.
I want to say that's very clear because I think so often this information, whether purposefully or not, is almost like gate kept from people of like, oh, well, you're not trying to get pregnant, so you don't need to worry about it. So
Mm-hmm.
often I hear that from people as like a doctor saying, well, why are you even worried about this? Are you trying to get pregnant? As if that's the only use of our cycle. And it actually enrages me to think about people living in pain, feeling frustrated, overwhelmed, confused by their own bodies just because they don't want to have a baby. Like, is that all we're good for? I beg to differ. It's actually my body. The system's happening in my experience, and I deserve to understand them and use them in any way I see fit, whether that means I have a child or not. It's literally a
Mm-hmm.
different conversation. So I want to make that very clear. Excuse me. Very clear because I feel like so much cycle education, rightfully so, but so often surrounds the conversation of fertility, of conception, or like the opposite end of the spectrum of birth control, of
Mm-hmm.
avoiding pregnancy. And those are useful conversations to have 100%. And people who need that information deserve access to that information. And also, like, there's so much more to do with cycles that literally has nothing to do with fertility, and it just kind of happens to be related to that conversation. So I probably won't really talk about fertility at all, because it's just, we have so many other interesting things to talk about.
That's true. Yeah, there is an episode on fertility. I think there'll be more in-depth potentially in the future. And also another episode with Sandra, who is in episode 60, or not 60, 97. Um, she will also be doing an episode. We will be doing an episode about birth control too. So if you're wanting to know more in depth about any of this stuff, sit tight. We'll have more stuff coming out. But
Yeah.
you can always send us a message, and I can send it to whoever I think is, or maybe more than one person. If you have any questions, and we'll get back to you.
Yeah,
But yeah,
absolutely.
I think that's totally. I think it's important to have the conversation beyond just fertility because there's a lot more to it than just that.
Yeah, it's like, I think it's just like this Western concept of like thinking of ourselves as all of these little pieces. Like, this is your heart health, this is your respiratory system, this is your, like digestive system. Over here is your reproductive system. Like, no, honey, everything's all connected. So, like,
Yeah.
what's happening over here? Like, hormones, like estrogen, progesterone, all of these hormones, like, they don't just go directly to the uterus and then
Mm-hmm.
do their work down there. They're affecting all of the systems. Everything's working together. And so I think it does menstruators such a disservice to say like, oh, you don't need to worry about that until you're trying to have a baby. Like, so if I
Mm-hmm.
never want to have a baby, I never deserve to learn and understand my body. That's crazy to me. It
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I experienced this in my, not to get too off track, but I think it's worth mentioning. Like, I experienced that in my own um journey with understanding my own cycle. The first time I had heard the mention of cervical mucus was from a cousin who was actively trying to get pregnant. And so had that advice from doctors to understand how to look at cervical mucus, what it means, how it helps you understand where you're at in your cycle. When you see more cervical mucus, especially the lotiony, and then even to the egg white texture, that means you're approaching ovulation. That means estrogen is super high. Like, I had never heard of any, I was like, cervical mucus, egg whites. Like, what are you talking about? I'd never heard of that because
Mm-hmm.
I was not actively trying to conceive. And it was so, and I remember her telling me this stuff. She's like, well, if you want to understand your cycle more, like, you have to look at your cervical mucus and it'll look like egg whites in your underwear or on your vulva. And I was like, what the hell is she talking about? Like, I don't even know. Like, I think if I had seen that, I would have been like, oh, maybe I have like a yeast infection. Maybe I have like, a bacterial infection in my vagina. Like, I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know that was like a normal thing. How is this not explained to us and told to
Yeah.
us? And it had, that's just like a kind of side a side journey, side quest conversation. But like this information is so useful and valid, completely disconnected from fertility. If you never
Absolutely.
want to have children, if you're never interested, if you're never even going to have sex with someone with a penis and sperm, like it's still very valid and important, and useful for you to understand your own body and understand how this system affects how you're feeling, and just going to help you like live in more harmony with your inner rhythms.
Hmm.
So with all that being said, slight tangent. Um,
An important tangent, I think.
Hopefully an important and useful to at least one person tangent. Yeah, so I say, should we just jump into talking a little bit about like what cyclical living is,
Yeah.
and then, how to do it, I guess.
Yeah. That sounds great to me.
So, yeah, okay, awesome. Okay, so really what cyclical living is, and I call myself a cyclical living mentor because I hope to both lead by example and to help guide you to create these practices and habits in your life. But to put it very simply, all cyclical living is living in alignment with your cycle, living in alignment with your inner rhythm as a menstruator, as a cyclical being. And I think I talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but I think it's worth mentioning again. This concept of our inner rhythms that are happening inside of our bodies as menstruators. So all humans, regardless of biological sex, regardless of gender, we have a circadian rhythm. This is our 24-hour clock. This is what helps us wake up in the morning, what helps us feel sleepy at night, by releasing those different hormones like melatonin and cortisol on that 24-hour clock. And it also guides so many functions like digestion, like, so many other things in the body.
Hmm.
Again, no system is independent. We're all big one connected blob.
Yeah.
Um, so the cool thing about being a menstruator is we have a secondary rhythm. We have a secondary clock, which is referred to as an infradian rhythm, aka longer than 24 hours, longer than a day. Thank you, Latin. And this is referring to our menstrual cycle, that roughly 29-day cycle. So while you, of course, have a 24-hour clock that governs when you wake up, governs when you sleep, we also have a larger overarching 29-day clock. And just like you would expect to feel differently at 8 a.m. versus 2 p.m. versus 8 p.m., you can expect to feel differently on day 2 of your cycle versus day 12 versus day 22 versus day 32. And I think that's like already, like if I were to leave people with one message, it would be that is that as someone with a menstrual cycle, you are not meant to feel the same every day. And this is not a failing on your part. It's actually exactly how you are meant to be feeling. One day, yes, you could maybe feel like that social butterfly and want to do a million activities and go for a run and wear the cute outfit and go out with your friends and like do all of the things. And then a week later, you want to order takeout, not speak to anyone. Like you don't even want to speak to the delivery driver. You want the drop off on your doorstep vibe. Like you want to
Yeah.
cuddle up with a book, hot tea, and like just disconnect from the world. And there's nothing wrong with that need of showing up as different versions of yourself throughout different times of your cycle and just throughout different times of your life. Like this is,
Hmm.
the same story, but bigger. And it's really important, I think, to talk about as menstruators, this kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Disconnection we might feel from how society is set up. Because
Hmm.
it's just frankly, it's just not set up with our cyclical nature in mind. And probably that's because we live in a patriarchy. And, that's a whole other conversation and a very worthy, important one to have, I think. But the way that society is set up for us to basically show up the same way every single day. Wake up, exercise, go to work, do the things, come home, like have that sort of repetitive type of schedule. And that's really not what works best for us as menstruators. And so it's really important, like when I talk about cyclical living, it's about looking at, instead of looking out to society to ask, what should I be doing with my day? What should I be doing with my time? Instead of looking outwards, you're really turning inwards to say, how do I feel? What do I need to do to support myself today? What advantages or strengths do I have today that I can harness and take advantage of? And looking at it in a slightly bigger picture. Instead of planning your schedule day by day, week by week, it's almost like you're looking at it and planning it as a month long, like me planning to be on a podcast episode when I'm feeling more energetic and social. If you had asked me to be on it 3 days ago, I would have said, that actually doesn't work for me. I need to go a few days later because I know that my energy is going to be low. My language processing skills are not going to be as polished, are not going to be as clear. I will maybe be like a little more brain fog, not feeling as social, a little cranky. Like it wouldn't be the vibe. And so
Hmm.
planning out things in a way that looks to your wisdom first. Looking to your wisdom first, I think would be like the tagline of cyclical living,
Yeah.
tuning into your wisdom first.
I really,
Um,
I
sorry, go
really
ahead.
like that aspect of, because I think it relates. I mean, I won't go too far down on this tangent, but I think it really relates to a lot of other stuff we talk about within the podcast and also within the work that I do with Move with Billy. Of we've A lot of us have been told to not like to stop listening to your body, like ignore hunger cues.
Yeah.
Like that's just one example of many, many, many. And I really like the part of this of like screw what everyone else says your day is supposed to look like. Like, how do you
Yeah.
feel right now? It goes like same into like screw what the people like your teacher says that your class is supposed to look like. How do you actually feel? What do you actually need? Of like coming back to
Yes.
your body and trusting that like you know your body best. You like not some other person, unless they like work extremely close with you for a very long time. You are the expert on your
Yeah.
body, and I just really love that aspect
Yeah.
of what you're just saying of like coming back to your own inner wisdom and like learning to check in first or like trust your body first.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is why, just as you have also, like with your anti-diet teaching that you do, it's the same reason that you've connected yoga with that. The same reason that why I've connected yoga with this, because
Mm-hmm.
that's what yoga does.
True.
That's what yoga allows you to do, is to have that first, just the space to connect with yourself without so much outer noise, which, is a rarity in our lives nowadays anyway. But also just to have those skills to be able to tune in and be able to connect with that inner wisdom and like understand, oh, I'm not tired, like that's a hunger cue or that's a thirst cue, or actually I need to go to bed an hour earlier tonight because I'm really struggling and I'm really tired. Like understanding those cues is, I think it's just, as you said, like it's not really something that we're taught. We're taught to disconnect from that intuition, that intuitive connection. We're
Mm-hmm.
not taught how to connect with it, and which is why I just very instinctively turned to yoga in my own personal journey, and like going through this process of like trying to figure out what was wrong with my cycle and try to figure out what type of birth control I could use, because I had such a disconnection with the type of birth control I was using. Like I didn't feel like myself at all. And it was like I just accidentally stumbled into yoga as a tool for that. Like I was doing
Mm-hmm.
yoga, for other reasons, because it was fun, because I liked it, because I connected in community, because it was, challenging me in unique ways. And then it was like, oh, but also it can really help me feel what's going on in all of this, in my
Mm-hmm.
head, in my body, in parts of me that I don't even notice.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I think it's so beautiful what you said. And I think that just that already proves our point of saying how this is so much more valuable than just fertility or just the concept of fertility, the
Absolutely.
conversation, because this is everything. Like being able to understand and connect with yourself, like that's everything in life. And it
Mm-hmm.
gives you so many more um opportunities to show up for yourself, like whether it be your physical well-being and physical health, like eating when you're actually hungry and not worrying about what the stupid diet plan said, or like understanding how to alter your exercise and sleep and all of these things in ways that actually serve you in the way that you need, but also in bigger ways of like being honest with yourself in relationships, being honest with yourself in big decisions like career choices and the friends you're hanging around, the activities you're choosing to do, like the different choices that you're making in order to make all those from an empowered place. You have to be very connected with who you are as a person, with what your priorities are, with what your goals are, with what your needs are, and not judging those needs and not wishing them different, but just actually answering them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
absolutely true. And it goes into it could be even a bigger conversation too of like the part of this work for me, um, of like learning to listen to my body was also I had to do a lot of trauma healing. And for me, my yoga mat was the first place that I felt like felt safe in my body and could do that check-in while it felt safe because it was like, okay, I'm not gonna like, I don't have to know how my whole life is feeling. I could just feel like, how does child's pose feel right now? Like, where do I
Yes.
feel this in my body?
Yes.
Um, and and for some folks who have trauma, it also is like it feel like a slow process, but it's a really important process of like teeny tiny steps end up going a really long way.
Mhm.
And there are still parts of this work that I just feel like it's worth mentioning just in case anyone else out there is like this is a factor that can come in and it can be easy to feel discouraged because sometimes making those decisions of like putting your like first you recognize your needs and then sometimes you have to put your needs out there or put them first. And
It's
as
hard.
someone who has literally just had a therapy appointment talking about this like
Yes.
2 hours ago, it is fucking hard. It's
Yes, it
hard to
is.
do. And that's okay. Like it's okay if you're like, oh, like I'm not very, I have a struggle with like putting my needs out there. That's okay. I get it. It's not an easy thing. For some people, it totally is, but not for everybody, and that's okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think what
Yeah.
you said is so powerful because it's like you can't just jump into the deep end and go from a place of not doing any of these practices into like, okay, how do I overhaul my entire life? And like, what do like that's like,
Yeah,
whoa, slow down. Like, that's very overwhelming. But
it
it's
is.
so beautiful what you said to ask, like, I don't have to know how everything is feeling, but how is child's pose feeling right
Yeah.
now?
Yeah.
Like, how is my toe feeling right now? Like
Yes,
even
exactly.
smaller. And that's why yoga is so powerful because you're like very slowly opening the door, very
Hmm.
slowly building that skill to feel safe to check in and feel
Yeah.
safe to connect.
Yeah. And because I know there's going to be at least one of you listening to this who's going to hear this, but we're going to talk about next and be like, "Okay, I'm going to overhaul my whole life. I'm going to do all these things."
Oh my God.
Totally get that energy. I do that too.
Yeah,
However,
guilty.
I want you to take a second right now and hear me say that if you start this today and then tomorrow you forget, that doesn't mean you failed. Maybe it means you start with one little tiny step. Like it's totally fine. Have that energy, whatever. I've been there too. You hyper focus on something and you're like, okay, this is my thing. And
Oh
then a
my
week later,
God.
you're like, I totally forgot about this. That's okay. Cut yourself a break, do one little step, and
Yeah.
it doesn't mean you failed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that because I am 100% like a dive in bitch. Like I
Me
will be
too.
like, this is my whole new personality and like I'm going to do everything. And
Yep.
then obviously it inevitably leads to me feeling completely overwhelmed, in
Hmm.
over my head, stressed, anxious. And then I'm like, okay, I'm just going to abandon this completely because it's too
Yep.
much.
Yeah. I just had this
Yeah,
happen. This is sorry. I'm gonna say this one little story, and then
I
we can
love
go
it.
in. I do this with a lot of things, which could be a whole other conversation about neurodivergency, but I recently was really into planting, like gardening, which I'm still into. It's still an interest, but I was like hyper focused on it. I started a bunch of seeds for the garden, like different vegetables. I, took the time, started the little seedlings, I transplanted some of them, started a bunch of new ones, was like really up on like, okay, this is the time where you're supposed to do this. And like that part of that type of cycle. Oops, sorry, I just smacked my microphone. And then literally a week later, not like I totally forgot the plants even existed. Almost all of the seedlings are dead.
Oh no.
Because I forgot to water. I had like gone away for a couple days. And my partner forgot to water them because we like forgot to have that conversation. And I was like, part of me was just like, you know what? Fuck the garden. Not doing it. I'm like,
This is too
I can
much.
get so. And then I was like, well, first of all, it's only May, so like I do have time. We can do more seedlings, and also you can go out and buy plants that are already established. Like,
Thank God.
yeah. So like this is something that like I definitely do too, and
Yeah.
I totally get like if you need to like pretend you're quitting for today, like you know what, fuck the garden. But then tomorrow or whenever you feel a little bit more grounded, recognize it's not the end of the world if you accidentally killed like 13, 15, however many seedlings. You can plant more, you can try
Yeah.
again, and
Yeah.
also you can try a different approach. Like maybe you get an already established plant.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
that is a completely relatable story. So you're definitely not alone.
Sweet.
I do the same thing with like
Okay.
every project pretty much.
Yeah.
And I think very useful, a perfect analogy for like so many things in life, but
Mm-hmm.
for this especially because I see that people tend to say, especially when I get into talking about cycle tracking and then the same side of cycle syncing and aligning your life with your cycle. It's like, I'm going to change everything at once. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
I applaud your excitement. However, let's take baby steps because those
Yep.
baby steps are going to be much more implementable, if that's a word,
I think
and
so.
actually be able to keep up with them long term. And that's what's going to make the difference because these
Yeah.
are, I think it's also, it can be really frustrating, especially when it comes to cycle changes and lifestyle habits and all of these things because I love, instant gratification. I know we all live in a world of instant gratification, but frankly, these things do take time and the changes do take time to really feel those effects. Just like a perfect example is that your egg really takes, the follicle from the very beginning stages until that follicle grows and develops and actually becomes a mature egg, which ovulates, is a little over 3 months. It's
Mm.
not just
Mm-hmm.
one cycle. It's not just one part. So realistically, if you start adjusting some habits, really you should give yourself at least 3 cycles, 4 cycles, 5 cycles to really notice those effects begin to take place and begin to feel the effects. It might
Mm.
happen a little bit sooner. And for certain things, of course, might take a little bit longer. But I think that's important to mention, as you said, because it could be very fun to like, I'm going to do everything.
Yeah.
And then you don't feel any benefits and you're overwhelmed and you're like, well, this sucks. Fuck this. I'm not going to do it anymore. And then you abandon it too soon. Like
Yeah.
you abandon it before it had a chance to work. So
Yeah. Yeah.
very important to mention. Thank you for sharing.
Perfect. It's like I planned it.
It's like you do this for a living. It's like you're a professional.
I like that. You couldn't see if you're listening to the podcast, but Ashley just did this like hair flip thing that was perfect. Really
Imaginary
made the
hair
moment
flip.
even better. Yeah. Just feel like you needed to know that part.
Yeah, crucial
Yeah.
information.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So with that being said, should we jump into cycle syncing and
Yeah, I'm
aligning? Okay,
excited. I'm
cool.
very excited for this conversation.
Same. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the basics already of the cycle: menstrual phase, follicular phase, ovulatory phase, luteal phase. You can also think of your cycle as sort of two halves if all four and the kind of scientific key
Hmm.
words are a little too much and a little too confusing. You could think of it as the estrogen dominant half, which is roughly from your period up until ovulation, and the progesterone dominant half, which is after ovulation until your next period. And I often talk about the estrogen and progesterone. I think I talked about this in the last episode as well, as sort of like they're not necessarily opposites, but they're sort of two halves of a whole. They're complementary energetically to each other. I often refer to them as the yin and yang energy,
Mm-hmm.
estrogen being the yang, progesterone being the yin. And so, in looking at kind of finding that balance in your overall cycle, and like, let's be honest, your life, you want to have a little bit of that balance between the two halves of your cycle and balancing these two hormones. A lot of um, frustrating period related symptoms like really painful periods, really bad PMS, really heavy bleeding, even irregular cycles are often a result of estrogen being too high in relation to progesterone. And that could be caused by multiple different things. Maybe you're overproducing estrogen. Maybe you're underproducing progesterone. Maybe you're doing both of those things and the gap is even wider. But really the way to create healthy, happy periods is finding that balance. And the way that you find that balance, both like finding the balance of estrogen and progesterone literal like hormone levels so that they're complementary to each other, but also just finding the balance like energetically is through aligning some habits and some lifestyle factors in with your cycle. So the way that you can align with your cycle, first you have to know what's going on with your cycle, of course. And we talked a lot more in depth, as you said, in the last episode about cycle tracking and how to begin tracking, what sort of things you should be tracking, should be looking for. And I even mentioned on the other one in my podcast, I did an entire like hour and a half episode about cycle tracking, going through different processes, different systems, even more in depth than we talked about. So listen to episode 96 here, and then even going to listen to that other episode to get even more in depth to understand how to track, what to do, all those things. But to put it very simply, when I say cycle tracking, this is just looking at different aspects of your cycle to understand where you're at in your cycle. So the first kind of most obvious is just tracking the day. So as you said, like I know I'm on cycle day 3, you're on cycle day 13. That already, when you know your rough pattern of your typical cycle, like you said, you're always around 35 days-ish. I know I'm usually around like 25 days-ish. So my cycles are a lot shorter than yours, but we can see, like if I know my cycle is usually around 25, 26 days, and I'm on day 3. Well, I'm on day 3. It's very obvious because I know that I'm bleeding. I know I'm on my period, but let's say I know I'm on day, they can't really miss that one. But if I were hypothetically were on day 13, I would know like, I'm about midway through my cycle. And I typically ovulate around this time. I'm getting into the ovulatory phase. Whereas you for cycle day 13, you might not be close. You might have another week before ovulation. It might be even longer than that. So that's really helpful that's very helpful to understand. And I talked about this in the last episode too, is ovulation doesn't happen on a specific day. We're not computers. We're not robots. We're humans after all. And the timing of ovulation can shift cycle to cycle. So cycle tracking can be as simple as counting the days and I don't want to say using guesswork, but using that sort of framework to estimate where you are in your cycle, not for birth control purposes or fertility purposes, but just for your own sanity of understanding like, the week before my period is coming, I might be a little more moody. I might be a little more sensitive. I might feel a little more anxious or bloated. That is not necessarily shouldn't be necessarily a surprise to me. And so to understand and make more space for those experiences in your life.
That's true. Like how many times have you seen, like, I'm just thinking of the amount of times I've seen people be like, they're like crying all the time. They're like really cranky. They have all these like things and like, I don't know what's wrong with me. And then you get your period. Speaking of someone who has done this,
100%.
You get your period and you're like, oh, I feel like this is helpful information now that I know all of this. Like, okay, maybe you'll know ahead of time so you won't go blaming yourself or like thinking something's wrong with you.
Yes.
And maybe you'll know.
Or like wanting to like blow up your life when you're PMSing. Like, I mean, that is also something like really worth, we can get into that. I always jump ahead. I just like get so excited. I want to talk about it. But it's so true. Just like understanding, it comes back to that kind of like, motto that I stand by is as menstruators, you are not meant to feel the same every day. So it's really helpful to understand why you're feeling the way you're feeling. And it's not in a way to discount it. Like, oh, you're hormonal. Like I fucking hate that statement, first of all, because every human has hormones of all different types, like rising and falling all the time.
Yeah.
And the concept of like, there's so much negative, like connotation, especially with the menstrual cycle and those hormones, saying like, oh, that menstruator, well, usually it's gendered language also. So that already irritates me, but like, oh, that woman is just hormonal. Like you can't trust her. She's this whole concept is like disgusting for so many reasons.
Yeah.
But also it's ridiculous because the menstrual cycle range of hormones is actually very predictable. It's very straightforward when you understand what's happening in your cycle
Mm-hmm.
versus the male hormonal cycle or people who have a testosterone dominant hormonal cycle. Their hormones, I mean, typically testosterone is high in the morning and then lowers throughout the day gradually, but also their testosterone can spike like completely randomly. Like if
Mm-hmm.
there are people they're attracted to in the room, testosterone just spikes randomly. If there are guns around, testosterone spikes randomly. So like this is to me like that's more unpredictable than our very predictable cycle of rising
Mm-hmm.
and falling hormones in a very like systematic circle. Um just saying. That's a little caveat. But just saying, my
Mm-hmm.
estrogen doesn't randomly spike just because I saw a sexy person. Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, chill. Um,
Yeah.
just had to go there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yes, so just understanding like when you might be feeling certain ways just allows you to take care of yourself better. It allows you
Mm-hmm.
to understand, like, you know, a friend asked you, hey, do you want to go grab a coffee next week? And I know I'm going to be on day one of my cycle. Like, I'm not going to be up for it. And so, learning to understand your needs, but as you said, like taking those baby steps of maybe voicing them out loud and saying to that friend, actually, I think like my period is going to be starting and I don't think I'm up for it. Like, would you rather meet, you know, this week while I'm, you know, before that, or like maybe the week after? And just
Mm-hmm.
like normalizing these conversations that as a menstruator, you're not meant to feel the same way every day. And what cyclical living is helping you understand not only like the kind of like generic predictions or the things that I describe, but also how your cycle feels in your
Mm-hmm.
experience. I think that's something too that's really important with cycle tracking because it allows you to not only hear like what I say and how I experience cycles or how I share about cycles, about kind of like what you might expect to feel, but knowing like, oh, for me, Ashley, I actually kind of get anxious around ovulation because estrogen is super high and that makes me a little scatterbrained and I can't really focus on one topic. And testosterone is high, so I'm kind of like jumping, bouncing off the walls. Like it's understanding yourself and how it feels in your experience too. And that's
Mm-hmm.
the difference between like reading a book that says during your period you should do X and during ovulation you should do Y versus like, oh, for me, Ashley, I feel this way when I'm in my luteal phase, or I feel this way in my follicular phase, and learning to adjust the things in your life that are adjustable
Mm-hmm.
and that can better serve you in that way.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I really like
Very
that
cool.
individual approach. I'm very excited.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like the overview of like what the concept of cyclical living is and what cycle syncing means. And I think I want to talk about because, well, let me just say one thing first, and then I'll jump into what I want to share. So there's literally no limit to how you can use this information. There's no limit on what area of your life you could apply this to. You could track your cycle, understand how you're feeling, gather those insights, and apply it to how you run your business. For example, planning all of your podcast recording when you're feeling most communicative, most social, most outgoing. You
Mm-hmm.
could you could use it to organize and plan your social life, planning activities only when you're going to be feeling upbeat. You could use it to plan how you run your household, when you do cleaning projects, when you do organization projects, when you write, you know, when you manage your bills, when you do bookkeeping, when you do like, there's literally no limit to how you can use this information. And as you so wisely mentioned before, of like, it's so tempting to be like, I'm going to plan everything around my cycle. And this is 100% a I wouldn't say necessarily mistake, but kind of mistake that I made in the beginning of being like, I need everything to perfectly align with my cycle, or I feel like my life is going to fall apart because this is my new personality. This is my new thing. This is my new obsession. And like, I want everything to work with it. And unfortunately, you know, as we talked about before, like we live in a patriarchy and not everything is adjustable. Not everything
Mm-hmm.
can be altered and changed to fit into this system to perfectly line up with my cycle. Like maybe I'm going to have to go to a friend's wedding on my period. because that's when her wedding is. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it is what it is, which literally happened. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? Um, but it's like those things, like you can't always know and predict and change everything in your life to go with your cycle. And so I want to focus on what I call the cycle health foundations, although not as maybe sexy or flashy or exciting as learning how to change your entire business or your entire life to align with your cycle. All those things are fun and cool, but they're like the cherries on top. The cycle health foundations are the what I would recommend as the first things to focus on,
Mm-hmm.
because one, they're like the most important things for overall health, and because they're the things that are going to have the biggest impact in helping you build better cycle health sooner rather than later and feel
Mm-hmm.
those effects sooner.
Mm-hmm.
So the four cycle health foundations are sleep, stress, nutrition/digestion, and movement or exercise. And these are the four sort of areas to focus on, especially when, I mean, for anyone, even if your cycle is, kind of textbook, quote unquote, perfect and you already feel great, like you can focus on these areas even, expand that and enhance that even more. But especially if you are struggling with painful cycles or irregular cycles or any type of cycle irregularity or abnormality, these areas are the first place to start and look at and analyze and understanding, like, maybe I can make some small adjustments that will help support my cycle health better, and
Mm-hmm.
understanding like where to go from there. Because if these things are all, already in alignment and you're already doing these things kind of ideally, to not use the word perfectly because that's not a thing as a human either.
Yeah, true.
But like, if you're mostly doing these things already, then it's like, okay, now, where else can I move after that? Like maybe looking at going to a doctor, going to a naturopath, as you mentioned, doing supplementation, other things that are like additional or a step further. I think so often we jump in and we're like, oh, there's this trendy supplement, there's this cool thing, there's this like special salad that's going to fix all my problems. And like, let's be real, it's not going to fix all your problems. Like it
Mm-hmm.
might help one little thing to eat a raw carrot salad. Yeah, that can help you balance estrogen. But doing that one thing is not going to change your overall cycle. So looking at these, what I call the cycle health foundations, and it's not as fun maybe of an approach. It's a little like, like, okay, I know I need to sleep well every night, but also like it's really important. And yes, we need to sleep well every night. So I would love to just go through kind of like the basics of each of them, and
Mm-hmm.
then I'll make sure my phone's not dying. Oh my goodness. Okay. And then make sure, and then talk about like how it might change phase to phase a little bit.
Sure. Yeah.
So sleep, first and foremost, again, sounds very obvious. And you're like, yeah, I know I should get good sleep. But yeah, it's very important for your cycle. And again, going back to that conversation of the circadian rhythm versus the infradian rhythm, understanding that these two rhythms, these two inner clocks, these two inner cycles are working in conjunction with each other. So getting, the good sleep that helps regulate the circadian rhythm is going to help influence and regulate that bigger infradian rhythm as well. So ideally, looking at 7 to 9 hours of sleep, going to bed around the same time, waking up around the same time, sleeping in a cool, dark room, not using electronics within an hour of bed. These are all like little tips that can help improve your sleep. And just taking a moment to like sort of evaluate where your sleep habits currently are. This is personally something that I very much struggle with. And it's something that I am still working on. Like I'm definitely a night owl type person. I would love to stay up until, all hours of the morning. And it's something that like I have definitely been working on over the last couple of years again, because it's not very fun. And I'm like, but I want to stay up and watch all the Lord of the Rings back to back. Like I don't want to go
Yeah.
to bed,
Yeah.
but like that's not probably the best choice all the time. And it's also, we're saying like it's not important to do everything perfectly either, and not like judging or punishing yourself where like, okay, one night you stay up late because you go out with your friends, like one deviation from that, these kind of rules is not going to destroy your cycle and ruin your life. And so
Hmm.
allowing yourself to be human within these guidelines rather than rules, and like allowing yourself to be human and have human experiences. I think that's also something that, especially when we get into talking about nutrition and exercise, that people can get very like laser focused on and forget that they're allowed to be a human and have a human experience.
True.
But with sleep, again, it sounds very basic, it sounds very simple, but it's very important. So in looking at how sleep needs change across your cycle, you might notice you need more sleep around your period, around the menstrual phase. Estrogen, progesterone are their lowest. Your body's expending a lot of energy to push out the uterine lining. I mean, you're literally losing blood, you're losing the nutrients in that sense. So like you're going to need more rest. You're going to need a little more sleep. I recommend getting more sleep during this phase, like literally allowing yourself to go to bed earlier, or even to take a nap if that's available in your schedule, like allowing yourself to get more sleep and not judging yourself, thinking like, oh, I'm so tired. Why do I need so much more sleep during this phase? Or I'm just too tired to go exercise. I need to take a nap instead. Like that is totally valid need during this phase of your cycle. So holding space and allowing yourself to actually answer and take care of those needs. As you progress through the follicular phase and into the ovulatory phase, you might find you naturally don't need quite as much sleep. Maybe you're feeling a little more energetic, and maybe you even have a little trouble sleeping as estrogen
Hmm.
is rising, which I think you mentioned earlier. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, interesting. Yeah.
It is interesting. I've had a couple of times, I just recently have been, because I've been doing a lot of this thinking about my cycle and stuff with the issues I'm having.
Yeah.
Um, I was just recently like, I wonder if the times that I can't sleep, where I'm just like, are, because there's times where I can't sleep and I don't feel as tired as I would have expected.
Yes. And then
So
sometimes
it's
you're
so
just
interesting. Yeah.
like
So you don't
flat
need
out.
as, yeah. So you don't necessarily need as much sleep around the follicular and ovulation phase.
Yeah. And you might even notice like you feel a little like a little more I don't know if insomnia is really the right word per se, because that's, like an actual not condition, but that's like an actual thing.
Hmm.
Um, but like maybe a little more restlessness in your sleep around ovulation. That's something
Hmm.
that I definitely experienced. And actually, something very interesting in talking about the lunar cycle, which we were talking about before we started recording, I just realized. So people will be like, what? We weren't talking about the lunar cycle. But Billy and I were talking about the lunar cycle. And actually, this has been observed around the full moon as well, which
Oh.
the full moon is correlated with ovulation. So super cool and interesting to
Hmm.
see that correlation, that connection. But yeah, maybe feeling a little more restless, or maybe just a little more naturally energized, and maybe like you need 30 minutes less of sleep, an hour less of sleep than you might have needed during your period.
Hmm.
Um, then we move into the second half of the cycle, roughly, the progesterone dominant phase of the cycle, aka the luteal phase. And you might notice the luteal phase, because it's also so long, can kind of be looked at in within that half into two smaller halves, the half closer to ovulation and then the half closer to your next period. And in the half closer to ovulation, you might still be kind of riding the high of ovulation. Estrogen is still pretty high, progesterone is on the upswing. And so you might not be noticing as much of a change. But as you get closer and closer to your bleed, progesterone and estrogen are both dropping back down. And so you might notice feeling more tired, more of a need to sleep, more need for rest. Also, interestingly, progesterone has a calming effect on the mind and body. And so, in looking at just like energetically how you're feeling, instead of like that pop, 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 pop type of vibe that estrogen might bring, it's more of like a sit back and chill type of vibe. And so just understanding that energetically of like looking at, how you're planning your sleep, planning your life, like maybe planning activities that feel more restful, or making more space for activities that feel more restful in your luteal
Hmm.
phase, understanding like, yeah, I might not have the energy and or like the focus and relaxed to like sit down and knit during my follicular phase, because I'm going to be too bouncing off the walls. But like that type of activity would serve me so well in the luteal phase, because I'm going to
Hmm.
be like automatically more chill, more relaxed, more like grounded. Um, in the luteal phase versus the follicular phase, for example. And yeah, so this is the 4 phases in relation to kind of like how your sleep needs can change and how you can adjust and make those small little adjustments. But also there's like the basics of sleep, of trying to get a good night's sleep every night, regardless of the phase, regardless of the phase of your cycle, where you're at in your cycle. And just understanding that that's probably like the foundational thing any human can do for better health is getting good sleep, roughly 8 to 9 hours. Menstruators need even a little more sleep than non-menstruators. So understanding that like there's nothing wrong if you need a little more sleep at certain times of your cycle, and just practicing those habits that help you get better sleep on a regular basis as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we can move into the second health foundation, which is stress. I think the biggest like difficulty I noticed with stress and working with people is just this tendency we have to sort of brush it off or ignore it or brush it under the rug, or not wanting to um address like stress factors in our lives. And stress, I think, can mean so many different things, and you can look at stress in different ways. You can look at it from a very like kind of analytical scientific way of like, it is stressful for my body to not get enough sleep, to be traveling and to be in unusual environments, to have an illness that's stressful on the body. So like all of those things are literal stress that or stressful type factors that influence how you're feeling. But also looking at it in a more like in the emotional or mental side of stress, and understanding how those impact and influence your overall health, but the health of your cycle, when you're not addressing those concerns of stress and sort of letting it like fester. I think that's when, like, for example, a job that you're in, like this is my personal experience of working as a flight attendant for 9 years, and like that growing stress over the years, like my body was, by the time I finally quit, was screaming at me that this environment was no longer aligning with me, that it was no longer conducive. Like I was getting physically ill every time I had to go to the airport because I was just so beyond. And like, was it literally physically, like scientifically stressful to put on a uniform and go in a car to the airport? Like that shouldn't be a stressful activity, but it was so, because of the mental and emotional stress surrounding that environment, surrounding that circumstance, it was creating physical symptoms and physical issues within myself, like immediately, but also in my cycle. And so understanding like how to recognize stress in your life, like if you always are stressed on your morning commute, maybe that means you want to plan a little more time on your drive. That's a very simple example, that's easy to address. But if it's something bigger, taking those baby steps, as you said, of like first understanding how you're feeling, maybe voicing it out loud to yourself, then maybe voicing it out loud to someone else, and then taking those baby steps of like slowly finding solutions to just be honest with yourself about the stress, look at possible ways to approach that stress, to manage those stressful circumstances, to help you feel better. And I think something else that's often not touched on in regards to, I put it in the stress category, but I think it could go in many categories, is the importance of pleasure, and especially orgasm, because it's such a powerful practice for your body, just to feel better. Like having an orgasm, experiencing physical pleasure, is something that releases amazing hormones for your mood and how you're feeling, and helps negate those stressful side effects, which have the opposite effect on your body. And so I think that's something to talk about in relation to different phases of your cycle, and like understanding like orgasm and pleasure in general can feel really different across your cycle. In your menstrual phase, maybe not feeling as connected to pleasure, to sensuality, versus in your ovulatory phase, maybe feeling super sensitive or super connected to all of your senses and pleasure specifically. So it's understanding that like it's completely normal to have libido changes across your cycle, understanding that your desire for pleasure, your desire for connection, even if it's just you with yourself or you with a partner, is completely normal to experience those changes across your cycle, and learning how to kind of track and understand how you feel across different phases of your cycle, and to be able to communicate that with a partner if you're involved with a partner, is like super powerful and super empowering to just be honest. Again, coming back to that conversation of like being honest with yourself about your needs, what you need at different times.
Mm-hmm.
I just noticed my phone is about to die. So let me get my charger
Sure. Let me
plugged
pause the
in.
recording. Okay, we're back.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So I think the most important thing in addressing stress in regards to your cycle is just, I mean, there's kind of two parts. Is one, using your cycle to understand how your needs are changing, because I think that will automatically reduce stress in a lot of ways, and understanding like, oh yeah, I'm not going to feel the same way every day, and not having that sort of what's the word I'm looking for? That misalignment and that judgment within yourself of wishing things were a different way, or like judging yourself, or I should be higher energy today, or why can't I do this, or why can't I
Mm-hmm.
focus, or whatever it is. I think that kind of automatically helps reduce stress, in the sense that it just helps you be more aware of how you're feeling and how to take care of yourself. And I think in another interesting way, looking at how how you change across your cycle, we kind of mentioned before about PMS and the late luteal phase right before your period, and understanding, not discounting, but understanding like, oh, I might feel a little more sensitive during this part of my cycle. I might feel higher anxiety than normal, or I might feel a little more emotional. And not to say that you shouldn't take those feelings seriously. You 100% should. You're feeling that way because your body is giving you an insight to, it's almost, I call the luteal, I think the luteal phase is often the most misunderstood part of our cycle, because it has that negative connotation of PMS and of being moody, quote unquote, and being emotional, and all of these like negative connotations that people have with cycles. But I think it's actually a really powerful time of the cycle, because it's like the rose-colored glasses of estrogen have been removed.
Mm.
When estrogen is high, everything might feel a little bit easier. Things might not bother you as much. An off-color comment might not hurt your feelings as much as it would when estrogen is low. And so I think it's a time where we are allowed and able to connect with like the more sensitive part of ourselves. And really, I think that's a huge talent, and or not talent necessarily, but a huge skill to be able to hold space for those parts of yourself and understand like, it's okay that I'm sensitive. It's okay that I'm emotional. It's okay that I have big feelings, or strong reactions to certain things, or feel very strongly. Like, you're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to voice your opinion. And I think that's why the luteal phase is so powerful, because
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like you're gonna voice your opinion whether people are ready for it or not sometimes.
I like that.
Yeah, and also understanding that like, okay, like I've said this, I saw a really funny reel this morning actually, that was like, it was a couple, and the male partner was saying the he was like, oh, when I tell my wife the same joke in different phases of their cycle, and her reaction was so different based on what phase she was in. So like the same exact joke about, oh, they thought I was a firefighter or something. And like one phase, she's like laughing and like, oh, that's so cute. And in the ovulatory phase, she's saying something like, oh yeah, you are sexy, and like jumps him. And then, I mean, it's obviously like kind of like silly, but I think it was actually interesting to see, because then in the luteal phase, or the menstrual phase, it was a completely different reaction. It was like, well, why would they say that? And what are you trying to mean? And it was just like
Mm-hmm.
understanding that you can be different versions of yourself, And there's nothing wrong with that. You're not meant to be the same every day. I don't know how many times I've said that, but I'll keep saying it till the cows come home. And like that, there's nothing wrong with feeling differently in different parts of your cycle. And also understanding with yourself of like, oh, maybe I feel a little more sensitive. Maybe I should wait with that reaction or that conversation until I see a little more variation of my perspective on it and getting a bigger understanding of how I really feel about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think on the other hand, the luteal phase can be super powerful for like you getting straight up and honest with how you're feeling. In another way, in the luteal phase, like if you notice every single cycle, the same conversation keeps coming up, the same argument keeps happening with your partner, the same frustration with your job. Like, I think that's a very powerful message from your intuition that something is misaligned here, something needs attention, something needs to be looked at a little more deeply. And so, in terms of managing stress, you know, having those hard conversations, not ignoring or writing off stressful situations or circumstances in your life, I think that can be a really powerful tool, is using that wisdom, using the sensitivity of the late luteal phase to address those things in your life and understand like, every single month, my partner, you know, makes these type of jokes or makes these type of comments that maybe I think it's like slightly amusing earlier in my cycle, but it really hurts my feelings later in the cycle. Like, you are completely valid in having those feelings and having those reactions, and it's worth it to have those conversations and share. Not, you know, kind of a weird way to look at stress, but like those little micro impacts throughout our day of things that cause a spike in emotion, a spike in stress, can impact your overall health and of course your cycle health too. So, you know, using the wisdom of the luteal phase to have those harder conversations, to take advantage of the maybe more sensitive way that you're feeling and using that wisdom.
Yeah. Oh, that's nice. I like that. I like that way of looking at things, because there's definitely been times where I've like had a roommate who was, I don't know, maybe had an annoying behavior, and then most of the month it was fine, but then every time like before my period I would get really like annoyed with it, and in the moment, like when it was happening, I was like, oh, you know, like write that off, like, oh, I'm just whatever, because like that's what we see all over the place.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I like moved out, or like we like weren't living together anymore, that I could see like, oh no, wait, this actually was a stressful thing for me,
Yeah.
and I shouldn't have had to put up with this. And I wasn't
Absolutely.
being like dramatic or anything. It was just like I had no patience then to deal with it. I
Oh
like
my God.
that
Yeah.
perspective. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Taking it even a step further, like getting slightly deep here, um, and like how I energetically look at the cycle, which I think is helpful for cyclical living and aligning and understanding like the, not backtracking on what I said earlier, but the, because not backtracking in terms of like your cycle is not just about fertility and not just about reproduction, but
Mm-hmm.
also your cycle is about reproduction, and understanding that as the kind of like quote unquote reason for how you feel different ways at different times of your cycle. So looking at it like
Mm-hmm.
this, in the first half of your cycle, from your period all the way up until ovulation, your body, whether you want to or not, your body is preparing for pregnancy. So your energy is opening up to others, because you cannot get pregnant without at least one other party involved.
Mm-hmm.
So your energetically, your like energy is completely open and you're welcoming things in. Energetically, estrogen is helping you do those things by making you maybe feel more social, higher language processing, literally looking more attractive when estrogen is high around ovulation. Like in scientific studies showing that people, your face is more symmetrical around ovulation. You actually look more attractive. You smell more attractive. So all of these things, all of these factors are bringing people in. Versus the second half, after ovulation has passed, that egg either got was going to get fertilized or is going to die. And there's nothing you can do after ovulation to make pregnancy happen. So your body is focused on protection. It's closing off now energetically. And in just understanding that very simple dichotomy of first half, I might be feeling open, second half, I might be feeling a little more closed, and understanding like why that is. Well, it's because reproductively, I'm open in the first half because I need, my body wants to have a baby or whatever, like wants is kind of like not really the correct word, but you know what I'm trying to say. Like it wants to, the system, the cycle, the goal is to create a fertilized egg. And the second half, the goal is to protect either that potentially fertilized egg and wait to see if it implants correctly. And so in that second half, yeah, you might feel a little more energetically closed and might feel a little more sensitive for that reason. Your energy is doing everything it can to block anything that's going to interfere with that egg potentially implanting, any like bad influence. And so maybe that explains why things are a little more annoying in the second half of your cycle versus the first half, because in the first half, your hormones are sort of making things a little smoother, a little nicer, because you're energetically open and welcoming things in, versus the second half, you're a little more energetically closed and like protecting yourself. So
cool.
Yeah, interesting to look at.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's very interesting. Sorry, I was just thinking, I'm just processing everything you said.
All right. Okay, so let's move into the third cycle health foundation, which is nutrition / digestion. Very complicated topic to talk about. And I think you probably have a lot of really interesting wisdom to share around, I know, around diet culture, around that entire realm of like, kind of going back to what you said before, looking to external rules instead of to your internal cues and internal awareness about eating habits and dieting, quote unquote, and nourishing yourself properly. In that same way, I think one of the biggest kind of mistakes, for lack of a better word, that I see is people just are simply just not eating enough food.
Yeah.
And they're not eating enough meals. And it's because they're following some, random guideline that someone has made up that maybe works for them or works for a certain group of people, but hasn't taken cyclical needs and cyclical nature into account, or lifestyle or personal needs and personal differences. Like every human is different. If we all ate exactly the same foods, we would all still look completely different from each other. So it's so silly to me to even think about like one diet plan, quote unquote, or an eating plan that like every human should follow. That doesn't even make sense logically.
Yeah. No, it doesn't.
And even more so with cycles, because not only are we different individuals, person to person, we're also different versions of ourselves at different parts of the cycle. And so our needs are going to change. So looking at it very broadly, I think generally speaking, people aren't eating enough. People aren't necessarily eating 3 meals a day with fat and protein and carbs in every meal, probably not getting enough fiber. And looking at like, that can be very complicated to look at eating habits. It can be very triggering to track food and to actually examine what you're eating. So that's a very difficult process to go about, I think, for a lot of people. But on the other hand, I think one very, very valid and worth doing, because being able to nourish your body without the guilt and restriction, I think, is very, very healing and very powerful experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can, I would say, just based on what you've said so far, I mean, I know you have more to share, but I think some people can get kind of like we said earlier, like you can really go into something and you can go really into it. Like if I know for myself, tracking things is a step toward, like, was a previous trigger step towards eating disorders. So just one approach I've heard and I've practiced is instead of necessarily tracking, if depending on what's going on with you, if you're like not sure if you're eating, like one of the things that I have a hard time with is eating enough healthy fats because of an old diet culture and eating disorder thing. And it actually has like shown up on my blood work a little bit. So I have to like occasionally, if I remember to be like, okay, wait a minute, have I had any today? Should I
Yeah.
like add some in rather than, so thinking of like adding in rather
Yeah.
than taking out.
I love
Um,
that.
I think can be sometimes helpful, and that you don't like, some people can track these things and not be triggered back into eating disorder territory. Some people cannot, such as myself, and both are valid and fine. Just know that like if this is a road you're going down, you might want a little extra support, like recovery support, whether it's like a friend who's also recovered and you just want to like, hey, if you notice this, can you like, bring it to my awareness, or like like a one-on-one coach who does this kind of work like I do, or whatever. Like if it already feels triggering to think about, you might just think about adding in extra support, whether you like listen to more anti-diet podcasts and books and follow the people who do talk about it or whatever, like set up extra support so that if it's a road you're wanting to go down, just takes teeny, 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 tiny steps. What can you add in? And then have the support so that it doesn't become a bigger like down eating disorder territory, because it is really hard and emotional and vulnerable, and it's more complicated now. And you're right, like people don't eat, honestly, a lot of us don't eat enough, or have these things like I do where I was like, oh, you can't have like anything that has fat in it. Now I have you know an
Yeah.
imbalance in that way.
Yeah, totally. I feel like
Mhm.
growing up, I'm a millennial growing up in the early 2000s. Like, I mean, it was a whole shit show in regards to body
Oh
image
yeah.
and just like actively, loudly promoting eating disorders and disordered behaviors. Like,
Yeah.
wow, like how did we even survive?
Yeah,
Um,
good question.
like for real though. But yeah, like specifically like no fat was I feel like was the huge focus and was the huge thing. So I think that's a very common thing that people deal with is like
Mhm.
not even necessarily being able to identify like what are quote unquote healthy sources of fat, and like having that visceral reaction to like fat, I shouldn't be eating that, that's bad, quote
Yeah.
unquote, like I can't do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's very common. And yeah, and I think what you said, I love how you said your focus on adding things in instead of the entire overhaul, the entire revamp. Even if it's not, even if you're like, oh, I can track food without it feeling triggering or without it feeling difficult, still sometimes it can just be like challenging to do that. Like it's a whole
Mhm.
job to do those things. I
Mhm.
mean, people literally are nutritionists and dietitians, like that's a whole profession. So even if that, even, whether it is triggering or not, focusing on like keeping it simple, making sure you're eating enough, I think is like the number one thing. Staying hydrated also, I think is the number one thing. Although I feel like there's more openness to that. People talk about being hydrated more. Um,
Mhm.
we both have been sipping our water throughout, so like
Yeah.
to us. But yeah, I think that's the number one thing with eating is not eating enough, probably that I see. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, but equally is very important, something that people don't necessarily talk about as much because again, not very sexy, but it's pooping every day. It's very important to poop every day. And the primary reason in terms of your hormones is the only way that your body is getting rid of excess estrogen is by pooping every day. It's
Hmm.
processed in the liver and then excreted as waste. And
Oh, I
so,
didn't know that.
yeah, and menstruators actually have a higher rate of constipation than anyone else, and which then only causes hormone imbalance to be worse because of that. So it's
Mhm.
really important to have 1 to 2 bowel movements a day. That's going to help to keep your hormones more balanced, more of that energetic balance between estrogen and progesterone. And will also just probably have you feeling better and less gassy, less bloated, less full. So that's, the bonus to that as well. In terms of changing your diet or aligning your diet with your cycle, again, I think can be a very complicated subject, and it's something that people tend to kind of go hog wild and get like very specific, like, oh, during my menstrual phase, I'm only going to eat XYZ. And then during my follicular phase, I'm going to eat these three things. And like, yes, you can do those things if it feels fun and supportive and not stressful and not challenging, like budget wise or what food you have available in your area. Like, yeah, that's really cool to eat specific foods that help promote balance in your hormones in different ways. Like I think I mentioned earlier, like eating raw carrots can help manage estrogen as well because it helps support the liver, or eating different type of seeds and seed cycling, eating different seeds at different points in your cycle. But that can be a lot. And I think it also can be triggering for people who've maybe struggled with disordered habits in the past to go into like orthorexia territory of I'm going very regimented and very strict, and I can only eat this at this time and only eat that at that time. I think a generally speaking, for most people, I think a healthier approach is to look at, as you said, what you can add in, where you can like gently adjust and not be so regimented and strict, but focusing on those foundations of like, am I eating enough? Am I having protein and fat and carbs with every meal? Am I getting fiber? Am I pooping at least once per day? Those are like the kind of the basics. And then once you feel solid with that, once you feel comfortable, then you can play around with some of the other stuff. Play around with eating a certain type of food at different points in your cycle, which is something I talk about a lot working with people one-on-one or in a group setting too, getting into like the fun, getting into the weeds and those things. But I think it's like, it can be very, very tempting to be like, oh, this influencer shared this supplement and this is going to change my entire thing. Or this influencer shared like this recipe, which is good for the follicular phase. That doesn't mean you can't eat that at another time in your cycle. It maybe just has an extra benefit to help your body process estrogen. But like if you're craving that meal in your menstrual phase, like you don't need to deny yourself those foods in a different phase of your cycle. So I think it's, to me, less is more in terms of the sort of like nitpicking of how you arrange your eating, and it's more important just focusing on eating enough and eating regularly.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. So I think that kind of covers it for what I want to say for nutrition and digestion. So moving to our fourth and final cycle health foundation. Oh, wait, I take that back. I want to share one more thing, which is important to understand about your nutritional needs across your cycle. In this roughly second half of your cycle, or when progesterone is dominant, you actually have a higher caloric need because progesterone is a thermogenic effect in the body. You're literally burning more calories. You have a higher need for calories in that phase of your cycle, and you might feel hungrier in your cycle. I think that was a huge game changer for me as well, to understand like when I'm feeling hungrier, when my quote unquote normal portion, I finish it and I'm still hungry, like that can be triggering for eating disorder past, and understanding like it's okay if I eat a little more today. At another time in my cycle, I might eat a little bit less. And so looking at the same way in productivity or managing your energy, looking at the bigger picture of your whole cycle and not worrying if you're worried about the amounts that you're eating. Like if I eat a little more today, another day, 2 weeks from now, maybe I'll eat a little bit less, and it's all going to balance out, and understanding you have different needs across your cycle. I think that's worth mentioning as well.
Yeah. I think it's important too to like recognize that sometimes you're like, there's so many factors in terms of when you're hungry. If it's like really hot, sometimes you don't get, you're not really as hungry. Or sometimes if you've like done more like a different type of movement the day before, then that day, then you might want to eat a lot more. But
Exactly.
it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It doesn't mean anything bad. Like give yourself permission to eat more if you're hungry, and don't, or even if you're not hungry, like it's also fine to have like a comfort snack, whatever. Like emotional eating is not as big of a deal as people on Instagram make it to be.
Yeah.
I mean, this is going into a whole other territory, but I just feel like this
really
part's relative, that like it's important. It's 100% fine. You also don't have to figure out why. Like if you don't feel like figuring out why you want like a second plate, it's fine. You don't have to figure it out. It doesn't really matter. You're just hungry, and that's the important thing. Give yourself permission to eat.
Yeah. Yeah. Say that like one more time for the people in the back.
Yeah, give yourself permission to eat. You don't need a reason to be hungry. You don't need to earn food. You just can eat food all the
Yes,
time.
thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. All right. So should we move into our final mental health foundation of movement/exercise? I think in the sort of opposite way of nutrition, the kind of most common issue that I see with exercise is people over exercising typically, and not understanding that your exercise, needs and capacity changes across your cycle. And so understanding like when I'm bleeding, I should not be going for the same type of exercise or going on the long run or hitting like a hardcore hit type workout or power vinyasa type yoga flow when I'm bleeding versus when at different points in my cycle. And so it's really important to understand like you're a different version of yourself throughout your cycle. And it's important to honor that, to take care of it. Your needs are different. Your capacity is different. And so why are you trying to fight against that nature instead honoring that nature and taking it easier when your needs are for more rest and then enjoying the high and firing it up and really going for it when your needs are for more action and more activity. So very briefly, just kind of touching on how those needs change across the cycle. When estrogen and progesterone are low in your menstrual phase, really resting is the exercise that you need to be doing, like literally taking a nap, literally resting, reading, or even like at most maybe going for a gentle walk in nature, or like a very calming yoga practice, something very gentle that's like comforting to you, whatever that version looks like for you. And I have to say too, like these different versions of intensity will be different person to person, because someone who's like a professional Olympic athlete, their version of a rest day is going to be different than my version of a rest day as someone who's not athletic, basically in any sense of the word. So understanding like your own variations within that context. As the follicular phase rises, you might be feeling that upswing of energy. Estrogen is rising. So maybe you want to go for a run. Maybe you want to do a little more cardio activity. Maybe that feels fun to you, doing a dance class or a yoga class, something a little more playful, or even like something a little outside of your comfort zone might feel a little more natural during that phase. Once you get into the ovulatory phase around ovulation, likely feeling energetically high during this phase. So doing the thing that is maybe hardest for you, like going to like the boot camp type class or a kickboxing class, a dance class, power vinyasa, like something that's really gets the sweat, the endorphins, like you're feeling great, you have your cute outfit on, like you're just in the vibes, and it feels fun to exercise in that way during that phase. Not like, oh God, now I got to drag my ass and do this horrible hit workout that I am dreading. Like, no, like this is the class where you come bounding in and you're like, let's go guys. And you're just feeling it. Like you're at that energetic place of connecting with that level of intensity. And then after ovulation passes, you're moving into the luteal phase, progesterone is dominant. Maybe noticing you tend to kind of, I don't know if burnout is the right word. And, I had a trainer, like the correct terminology for this, but like you might notice you sort of hit your max a little faster. You hit your limit a little sooner than you would in the first half around follicular and ovulation. And not judging yourself, not saying like, oh, last week I could have, squatted 200 pounds and this week I could only squat 100 or 150. Like, what's wrong with me? Just understanding like your hormones are affecting you. That's all. Your body is working as a human's body should. There's nothing wrong. That's exactly what you could expect to feel. So understanding that and adjusting your workouts to align with that. I personally find during the luteal phase, I tend to like a nice long, like quiet run with a podcast or with like relaxing music, versus in the follicular phase, it's like a chaotic, like super fast run. And I'm listening to like Christina Aguilera and just like Spice Girls and like feeling the like excited vibes, versus the luteal phase, I'm more like listening to like an educational podcast as I like take my long meandering stroll through the park, and just understanding those differences and not judging yourself. I think always comes down to that at the end of the day, not judging yourself for needing different things at different times of your cycle. And I think a few interesting things to note. I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, coming back to that concept of in the luteal phase when progesterone is high, your body temperature is literally higher. You have a thermogenic it has a thermogenic effect on the body. So literally raising the body temperature might be feeling that burnout a little faster, a little earlier in your run or a little sooner in your workout. And so making extra, taking extra care to hydrate yourself even more and just adjusting your workout as necessary. Also, one thing to note is when estrogen is really high, the end of the follicular phase moving into the ovulatory phase, you have a tendency, you could have a higher instance or higher rate of injury to ligaments or joints because estrogen has a more elastic effect on our ligaments and joints. So taking extra caution when you're doing the fun, crazy, energetic type workout of like making sure you have proper alignment, making sure, you're wearing like proper footwear for hiking or running, and just taking a little extra care to take care of yourself. Don't get too carried away by the fun energy of ovulation.
Yeah, that's fair, definitely fair.
Yeah, I think that kind of covers it for exercise, unless you have any questions or want to add anything with your expertise too.
I think that I don't know. I feel like there is stuff I could add, but I don't know if it's necessary. I guess I'll just say like with any of this, depending on where I've done some episodes and I've talked a lot about where you're at in terms of your healing your relationship with movement from being either an eating disorder, disordered eating, whatever, being in diet culture, it can take a long time to heal. And if you're at the beginning stages of that healing process, I would just say lean into the things that feel good, like that you like doing. And if you're like a person who doesn't like movement, I can't remember which episode I talked about this with, but they're talking about like your grumpy little walk. I think it was the episode maybe before our previous one. There's like, I can't remember who it was. Anyway, like
instead of the hot girl walk, go for
yeah,
like the gremlin walk.
Yeah, exactly. But like if when I first started healing my relationship with movement, any of this stuff probably would have been a little bit too much to think about.
Yeah.
Which is if you're feeling that way, it's totally fine. Don't have to rush your healing process. Like just do the things that feel good and like worry about this later on. If you're doing the little steps, this is probably a little step for later on. And if you're like, I'm at the process now, or at the point now where I mean, the healing process doesn't end, unfortunately. Sorry to break it to you. It's a long process, but I'm at the stage now where I'm able to, like I've talked before about how, there's certain movements I don't like doing before I go. Before I go for a run, hate it. While I'm on the run, most of the time, hate it. How I feel after, that's why I go, because I feel so much less stressed out. So you might just note some of those things. Like if we've done this, I do this work with one-on-one clients a lot, and I do sometimes in the group in the Rebel Movement Club, but if you have sort of a list, like in the homework I've probably given you of like what movements help you feel certain ways, if you know that like, say for example, like the stretch and unwind yoga class helps you feel really rested and helps you sleep better, maybe that's something that you think about having for your second half of your cycle. If you notice like, okay, I like love going for like, I don't know, an interval run, and that's super fun, and I usually feel like really energized and connected after. Maybe that's something you do like the first half after you stop bleeding, but you might just like bring in some of that information. You don't have to start a whole new thing. You also don't have to go towards it if you're not at the phase yet. It's fine. Don't rush it. The biggest thing you can do, my biggest advice, if you're not sure where to start, just notice how it feels. If you like have a habit of going for runs, you hate how you feel during, before, and after, maybe you just give yourself permission to not go on runs. And maybe you like do a YouTube dance class instead. And then notice how that feels. Just like you're gathering information in as neutral of a way as possible.
Yes.
If your movement is stressing you out and it doesn't even have any benefits afterwards, like fuck it. Don't do it.
Like,
yeah,
you can
exactly.
run your whole life without going for a run.
Exactly.
Have to do. I think thank you so much for sharing. I'm like literally so lit up by everything that you just said. And I think that's probably the most important thing, which I definitely should have said first. but that just came to me with your brilliance, so thank you, is like exercise in a way that you actually enjoy. Like, don't do things that you hate because
Mm-hmm.
while it might look good technically, like on paper, to be doing cardio or moving your body in that specific way, if you hate it the entire time, like the stress it's bringing you emotionally and mentally is going to like negatively impact the benefits that it would have had. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, that's the first rule, as you said, like, do things that you actually like, do things that you actually enjoy. And looking at it, as you said, like, I really love how you explained like analyzing in a very neutral way, like, okay, I don't like the before or the during of running, but I like the after. So, like, where could I place this in my routine or my cycle in a way that feels least cumbersome, like
Mm-hmm.
least frustrating,
Mm-hmm.
and that I can still get the benefits from it. So I
For
love
sure.
that. And I think you could
Mm-hmm.
actually use your cycle to help you figure out a lot of those things too,
Yeah.
in looking at like kind of like if you are going to test out a new thing, maybe you want to test out a dance class and see what those effects are neutrally, sort of analyzing if it's a type of exercise you'd like to engage in, doing that, planning that for a time in your cycle where you're already feeling a little bit more like adventurous
Mm-hmm.
or like around the follicular phase, around the ovulatory phase, because it's going to feel a little easier to get over that hump of like anxiety of like going to a new place and what do I
Mm-hmm.
expect and what's the parking like and are people going to be nice and are they friendly here? Are they open? Are they inclusive? Like all of those stressors that can come up with a lot of different types of exercise, yoga included. Like it could be overwhelming to start to try to do new things in so
Yeah.
many ways. And so just like planning that for times in your cycle, that might be, it might feel a little easier, it might feel a little more natural to try those new things.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's a very good idea.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yay.
so
Yeah.
much. This was so fun. I don't, is there anything else that you want to share before we wrap up? Or I know like not, I'll get you to plug in a second, but I just mean like
Yeah.
based on
Yeah.
like what we've talked about.
I mean, I think there were so many little interesting nuggets that were unplanned that just came out during this episode.
Yeah.
And I think kind of coming back to where we started and just understanding that like you deserve to implement and understand this information for the sole benefit of yourself. Like there needs to be no other reason other than you just want to feel better in
Hmm.
your cycle and your body. It doesn't matter if you never want to have a baby. It doesn't matter if there's not like a medical reason or problem or issue to address. Like you deserve to learn this and understand these things just for yourself, just because you want to. Like that's enough of a reason. And so
Yeah.
I think my advice would be like, don't wait for the people who are like, oh, I kind of want to learn about this, but like I don't really have a reason, or like I don't really want to get pregnant, or like I don't really know if it's really necessary or any of these things. Like I would say if you're interested in it and you're curious and want to feel more connected to your body, feel more connected to your cycle, like you don't need a reason other than you want to. Like
Hmm.
that's enough of a reason. And
Hmm.
so, you deserve it to give that gift to yourself if it's something you desire. And there needs to be no other explanation to other people. I cannot count how many times in my life when I bring up cycle tracking or understanding my cycle, how many people say, "Oh, you must be trying to get pregnant." From doctors to friends to
Right.
family members. And like I understand where they're coming from because that's the current culture and the current associations with this type of work and with this type of lifestyle. And every time it's like, no, I'm just doing it for me. And
Hmm.
like, that's enough. You deserve to
It's
give that to
enough.
yourself.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's important. I think that's a really good note to bring back from the beginning is that it doesn't have to be for like you don't need a reason. You can just do it because you want to.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly.
Hmm.
And I think that's a very powerful reason on its own.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's awesome. I think that's a really empowering thing. I've learned so much from our last two conversations. Um, thank you
Yay.
so much for sharing your time and your energy and your wisdom with us. Can you let people know where to find you?
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. I've had so much fun
Ah,
talking to you.
good. I'm glad. Yeah, it was so fun.
All right. So you can find me. I'm most active on Instagram Although I really haven't been over the last month because I've been moving, but I am getting into it, guys. I'm coming back to life. I'm getting settled. So you can find me on Instagram. My handle is at cyclical_yoga. That's CYCLICAL_YOGA. You could also find me at that almost same name online, www.cyclical-yoga.com. From my website, from my Instagram, you can reach out to me over DM, of course. You can reach out to me over WhatsApp. I have all sorts of offers to check out, ranging from free all the way to, a high ticket private offer. So there's a lot of range of variation within working with me and how I like to help people. I mentioned I have a podcast, so that's of course a free offer. I share all sorts of stuff on Instagram too, of course, for free. And there's some exciting paid offers coming up very soon too. So
Awesome.
all sorts of ways to work with me, and you can probably tell from how much I love talking about this stuff that I'm kind of obsessed. So like I love when people DM me and they're like, I have this really weird specific period question. I'm like, ooh, please tell me. Like I would love to hear about it.
Oh,
So
awesome.
please DM, tell me you heard me on Billy's podcast. And yeah, I'd love to chat with your period about you.
Awesome.
About your period with you.
Perfect.
I'd love to chat with your period about you. That would be amazing.
That would be amazing. If just in case you're listening to this episode while you're driving or anything like that, I will post her the Instagram and website in the show notes below, and then you'll be able to find everything from there. So don't worry about like, oh no, I can't write this down. It's written down for you. There is, I think, on Spotify. If you're listening on Spotify, if you like scroll down, there's an option to put in a question right through this episode. I have no idea if that's on other platforms. So you can always send me an email, info@movewithbilly.com. If you have a question that you're wanting to be, for example, if you're wanting it to be anonymous, if you're feeling a little nervous, or if you like think that other folks might want to know the answers or whatever, you can always send them in that way. And then I'll make sure, of course, that Ashley gets those. And just forgot if you have feedback, if you liked this episode, if you have feedback for us of any kind, send them again, info@movewithbilly, BILLIE. And I'll make sure that everyone gets them. And then I just want, again, thank you so much for being here. This was so fun. I learned a lot. I know everyone else will learn a lot, and I'm just so thrilled with these episodes. So thank you.
Yay. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. If you want to connect more with me, if you want to send any questions, send them to info@movewithbilly.com. If you sign up for my newsletter, that's the best way to stay in contact with me. But you can also follow me on Instagram @movewithbilly. I'm on TikTok as well as Facebook. If you have a second, I would love it if you could rate, review, and subscribe this episode or to this podcast, and maybe review this episode if that's a possibility on the platform you're on. And if you would like to support this podcast, you can buy me a coffee. The link is in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you learned as much as I did from these episodes with Ashley, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.